Hey guys, I want to apologize for the mess. Kind of doing this last minute, um, so I don't really have much planning. I wanted to go ahead and apologize. I know it's been a while since I said I was going to update my channel, but I did have some family issues that happened. My dad had a stroke, and it was pretty bad for a little while. So I was busy with family and taking care of that, and so here I am. I can't promise a schedule just yet, because I am starting a new job on Monday. So I don't know how tired that's going to make me or how the kids are going to react or anything. So sorry, Nidge. So for now it'll be sort of on the fly. So I also have been growing my nails out for you guys. They're kind of stubby now. I'm painting them so I don't chew them, so I can eventually do some tapping for you guys when I get a better setup. Anyway, this is a lavender candle with a wood wick, so I'm going to go ahead and light that. I would light it with matches, but I tried doing that the other day, and it took literally 7 matches before it would catch, and I burnt my fingers. So put that away. Okay, so what I'd like to do is start reading a book I have on hand, which is this wonderful book. It's called Washington, and it's I'm sure you can tell, but it's a biography of George Washington by Chernow. And I've been reading a little bit of it. I didn't want to get too far ahead of you guys, but I wanted to make sure it was a good book, and was informative, because I don't know if you guys have read history books, but some of them can have wrong information, or the author can have a specific sort of slant to what they're writing, and I didn't really want to do that. Everything's going to have a slant. Everyone has their own views of things, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't like super pushy or just like all-encompassing. And anyway, so this one is really good and interesting, which is pretty important to me too. Okay, so we're going to dive right in here, and hopefully this doesn't take too long. The first chapter, because I don't really know how much time I have. Okay, so this is Washington, A Life by Chernow. It's a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He also wrote Alexander Hamilton's biography, which I have, and Grant, about Ulysses Grant, which I also have. It's actually right beside me. But right now I figured we could focus on the founding fathers. These are just a few pages of reviews, and it has a little about the author right here. I'll read that to you. It says, Chernow is the prize-winning author of 7 books and the recipient of the 2015 National Humanities Medal. His first book, The House of Morgan, won the National Book Award. Washington, A Life won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, and Alexander Hamilton, the inspiration for the Broadway musical, won the George Washington Book Prize. His new biography, Grant, was published in 2017. A past president of PEN America, Chernow has been the recipient of 8 honorary doctorates. He resides in Brooklyn, New York. And it starts with a quote. "Simple truth is his best, his greatest eulogy." And that's Abigail Adams speaking of George Washington after his death. And now it's the contents. There are a lot of pages in this book, I'm sure you can tell. Alright, we're at the author's note. My glasses look crooked. Since I quote extensively from George Washington's vast correspondence, which I actually have, so if you guys are interested in me reading that, I have a huge book of it. It's super thick, it's not even all of it, but if you're interested in having me read it. I also have Alexander Hamilton's correspondence, Thomas Jefferson's, so yeah, just let me know in the comments if you're interested in hearing me read that. Anyway, since I quote extensively from George Washington's vast correspondence, I have taken the liberty of modernizing the spelling and punctuation of the 18th century prose. A biographer hesitates to forfeit the special period flavor that comes from preserving all the oddities of contemporary writing. But all too often, Washington's muscular style can seem awkward and stilted to modern readers because the way he distributed his commas, for instance, whereas the writing suddenly becomes smooth and flowing with more familiar punctuation. Occasionally I retain the quirks of the original spelling in order to highlight the eccentricity or lack of education of the personality in question. Throughout the text, the actual wording has been exactly reproduced. And this chapter is the prelude, called The Portrait Artist. In March 1793, Gilbert Stuart crossed the North Atlantic for the express purpose of painting President George Washington, the supreme prize of the age for any ambitious portrait artist. Though born in Rhode Island and reared in Newport, Stuart had escaped to the cosmopolitan charms of London during the war and spent 18 years producing portraits of British and Irish grandees. Overly fond of liquor, prodigal in his spending habits, and with a giant brood of children to support, Stuart had landed in the Marshalsea prison in Dublin, most likely for debt, just as Washington was being sworn in as first president of the United States in 1789. For the impulsive, unreliable Stuart, who left a trail of incomplete paintings and irate clients in his wake, George Washington emerged as the savior who would rescue him from insistent creditors. "When I can net a sum sufficient to take me to America, I shall be off to my native soil," he confided eagerly to a friend. "There I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone. I calculate upon making a plurality of his portraits, and if I should be fortunate, I will repay my English and Irish creditors." In a self-portrait daubed years earlier, Stuart presented himself as a restless soul with tousled reddish-brown hair, keen blue eyes, and a strongly marked nose and a pugnacious chin. This harried, disheveled man was scarcely the sort to appeal to the immaculately formal George Washington. Once installed in New York, Stuart mapped out a path to Washington with the thoroughness of a military campaign. He stalked Washington's trusted friend, Chief Justice John Jay, and rendered a brilliant portrait of him, seated in the full majesty of his judicial robes. Shortly afterwards, Stuart had in hand the treasured letter of introduction from Jay to President Washington that would unlock the doors of the executive residence in Philadelphia, then the temporary capital. As a portraitist, garrulous Stuart had perfected a technique to penetrate his subjects' defenses. He would disarm them with a steady stream of personal anecdotes and irreverent wit, hoping that this glide patter would coax them into self-revelation. In the taciturn George Washington, a man of granite self-control and a stranger to spontaneity, Gilbert Stuart met his match. From boyhood, Washington had struggled to master and conceal his deep emotions. When the wife of the British ambassador later told him that his face showed pleasure at his forthcoming departure from the presidency, Washington grew indignant. "You are wrong. My countenance never yet betrayed my feelings." He tried to govern his tongue as much as his face. "With me, it has always been a maxim rather to let my designs appear from my works than by my expressions." When Washington swept into his first session with Stuart, the artist was awestruck by the tall, commanding president. Predictably, the more Stuart tried to pry open his secretive personality, the tighter the president clamped it shut. Stuart's opening gambit backfired. "Now, sir," Stuart instructed his sitter, "you must let me forget that you are General Washington and that I am Stuart the painter." To which Washington retorted dryly that Mr. Stuart need not forget who he is or who General Washington is. A master at sizing people up, Washington must have cringed at Stuart's facile bonhomie, not to mention his drinking, snuff-taking, and ceaseless chatter. With Washington, trust had to be earned slowly, and he balked at instant familiarity with people. Instead of opening up with Stuart, he retreated behind his stolid mask. The scourge of artists, Washington knew how to turn himself into an impenetrable monument long before an obelisk arose in his honor in the nation's capital. As Washington sought to maintain his defenses, Stuart made the brilliant decision to capture the subtle interplay between his outward calm and his intense hidden emotions, a tension that defined the man. He spied the extraordinary force of personality lurking behind an extremely restrained facade. The mouth might be compressed, the parchment skin drawn tight over ungainly dentures, but Washington's eyes still blazed from his craggy face. And the enduring image that Stuart captured and that ended up on the $1 bill, a magnificent statement of Washington's moral stature and sublime visionary nature. He also recorded something hard and suspicious in the wary eyes with their penetrating gaze and hooded lids. With the swift insight of artistic genius, Stuart grew convinced that Washington was not the placid and composed figure he presented to the world. In the words of a mutual acquaintance, Stuart had insisted that there are features in Washington's face totally different from what he ever observed in that of any other human being. The sockets of the eyes, for instance, are larger than he ever met with before, and the upper part of the nose broader. All his features, Stuart observed, were indicative of the strongest and most ungovernable passions, and had he been born in the forests, it was his opinion that Washington would have been the fiercest man among the savage tribes. The acquaintance confirmed that Washington's intimates thought him by nature a man of fierce and irritable disposition, but that, like Socrates, his judgment and great self-command have always made him appear a man of a different cast in the eyes of the world. Although many contemporaries were fooled by Washington's aura of cool command, those who knew him best shared Stuart's view of a sensitive, complex figure full of pent-up passion. His temper was naturally high-toned, that is, high-strung, but reflection and resolution had obtained a firm and habitual ascendancy over it, wrote Thomas Jefferson. If ever, however, it broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in wrath. John Adams concurred. He had great self-command, but to preserve so much equanimity as he did required a great capacity. Whenever he lost his temper, as he did sometimes, either love or fear in those about him induced them to conceal his weakness from the world. Governor Morris agreed that Washington had the tumultuous passions which accompany greatness and frequently tarnish its luster. With them was his first contest, and his first victory was over himself. Yet those who have seen him strongly moved will bear witness that his wrath was terrible. They have seen, boiling in his bosom, passion almost too mighty for man. So adept was Washington at masking these turbulent emotions behind his fabled reserve that he ranks as the most famously elusive figure in American history, a remote, enigmatic personage more revered than truly loved. He seems to lack the folksy appeal of an Abraham Lincoln, the robust vigor of a Teddy Roosevelt, or the charming finesse of a Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, George Washington has receded so much in our collective memory that he has become an impossibly stiff and inflexible figure, composed of too much marble to be quite human. How this seemingly dull, phlegmatic man, in a stupendous act of nation-building, presided over the victorious Continental Army and forged the office of the presidency is a mystery to most Americans. Something essential about Washington has been lost to posterity, making him seem a worthy but plodding man who somehow stumbled into greatness. From a laudable desire to venerate Washington, we have sanded down the rough edges of his personality and made him difficult to grasp. He joined in this conspiracy to make himself unknowable. Where other founders gloried in their displays of intellect, Washington's strategy was the opposite. The less people knew about him, the more he thought he could accomplish. Opacity was his means of enhancing his power and influencing events. Where Franklin, Hamilton, or Adams always sparkled in print or in person, the laconic Washington had no need to flaunt his virtues or fill conversational silences. Instead, he wanted the public to know him as a public man, concerned with the public weal and transcending egotistical needs. Washington's lifelong struggle to control his emotions speaks to the issue of how he exercised leadership as a politician, a soldier, a planter, and even a slaveholder. People felt the inner force of his nature, even if they didn't exactly hear it or see it. They sensed his moods without being told. In studying his life, one is struck not only by his colossal temper, but by his softer emotions. This man of deep feelings was sensitive to the delicate nuances of relationships and prone to tears as well as temper. He learned how to exploit his bottled up emotions to exert his will and inspire and motivate people. If he aroused universal admiration, it was often accompanied by a touch of fear and anxiety. His contemporaries admired him not because he was a plaster saint or an empty uniform, but because they sensed his unseen power. As the Washington scholar W. W. Abbott noted, an important element in Washington's leadership, both as a military commander and as president, was his dignified, even forbidding demeanor. His aloofness, the distance he consciously set and maintained between himself and nearly all the rest of the world. The goal of the present biography is to create a fresh portrait of Washington that will make him real, credible, and charismatic in the same way that he was perceived by his contemporaries. By gleaning anecdotes and quotes from myriad sources, especially from hundreds of eyewitness accounts, I have tried to make him vivid and immediate rather than the lifeless waxwork he has become for many Americans, and thereby elucidate the secrets of his uncanny ability to lead a nation. His unerring judgment, sterling character, rectitude, steadfast patriotism, unflagging sense of duty, and civic-mindedness, these exemplary virtues were achieved only by his ability to subdue the underlying volatility of his nature and direct his entire psychological makeup to the single-minded achievement of a noble cause. A man capable of constant self-improvement, Washington grew in stature throughout his life. This growth went on subtly, at times imperceptibly, beneath the surface, making Washington the most interior of the founders. His real passions and often fiery opinions were typically confined to private letters rather than public utterances. During the Revolution and his presidency, the public Washington needed to be upbeat and inspirational, whereas the private man was often gloomy, scathing, hot-blooded, and pessimistic. For this reason, the new edition of the Papers of George Washington started in 1968, and one of the great ongoing scholarly labors of our time has provided an extraordinary window into his mind. The indefatigable team of scholars at the University of Virginia has laid a banquet table for Washington biographers and made somewhat outmoded the monumental Washington biographies of the mid-20th century. The 7 volumes published by Douglas Southall Freeman, 1948 to 57, and the 4 volumes by James T. Flexner, 1965 to 72. And this book is based on a close reading of the 60 volumes of letters and diaries published so far in the new edition, supplemented by 17 volumes from the older edition to cover the historical gaps. Never before have we had access to so much material about so many aspects of Washington's public and private lives. In recent decades, many fine short biographies of Washington have appeared, as well as perceptive studies of particular events, themes, or periods in his life. My intention is to produce a large-scale, 1-volume, cradle-to-grave narrative that will be both dramatic and authoritative, encompassing the explosion of research in recent decades that has enriched our understanding of Washington as never before. The upshot, I hope, will be that readers, instead of having a frosty respect for Washington, will experience a visceral appreciation of this foremost American who scaled the highest peak of political greatness. And that was the prelude. Let's see how long chapter 1 is. It's a bit too long for me for tonight. So unfortunately, that's where we'll have to stop for the moment. I'll close that up. So I do have a Patreon made. I don't have any rewards set or anything like that, because I don't know how often I could get them out. If you guys would like the link, I will put that below in the video. There's really nothing on it. And I can put my PayPal as well. But as of now, I'm basically just doing these videos for fun and to inform everyone, and sort of to forget the stress that's going on in my life at the moment. Any money that you donate will of course go to getting new material, like an actual, although the cell phone is doing pretty good, but like an actual microphone, more books like this one, materials like documents and stuff, obviously not actual documents but copies of them, and the usual. So let me know if you liked it in the comments, or what you'd like me to change or add, and I will see what I can do about that. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and that you sleep really well.